Day 10, April 14th, 1865. Assassination. Washington, D.C., 8 o'clock a.m. Abraham Lincoln is already at his messy desk. As usual, the War Office delivered a stack of fresh telegrams during the night. Reading them is how he begins each day. He's expecting good news. He flips through the telegrams to see if anything has arrived from General Sherman, whose troops are rushing to capture the important Confederate seaport of Savannah, Georgia. After Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox a few days ago, and the fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital, a week before that, a victory by Sherman would mean the end of the fighting. Lincoln has no doubt the war will end without another large battle. The news about Lee and Richmond has put Washington in a good mood. Because the city is located right on the edge of the Confederacy, it's been under the threat of invasion since the war began. Residents, exhausted by the tension, are now giddy. Celebrations began soon after the news about Lee was announced 5 days earlier. The troops guarding the city fired the cannons in salute. Happy crowds have been outside the White House since the news broke. But the celebrations have made one man nervous. Colonel William H. Crook, the Lincoln's main bodyguard, arrives to begin his shift. As usual, he starts the day by checking that a guard is present outside the president's office door. Then, in a change from routine, he steps outside to keep watch on the drunken crowd in the nearby streets. Even though it's early morning, the celebration continues. Later, he admits to be a worry. Those about the president lost somewhat of the feeling, usually present, that his life was not safe. Because the war was essentially over, they were less careful about the president's safety. But he will be off duty this evening when the Lincolns attend a show at Ford's Theater. A backup will have to take his place. All the world's a stage. In a hotel just blocks from the White House, John Wilkes Booth, proud of his handsome looks, combs a scented, greasy wax through his curly hair. He's an actor from a famous theater family, and it shows in his dramatic flair. His clothes are expensive and immaculate. His boots are shined, as always. His imagination is just as dramatic. He believes he can save the Confederacy. A few weeks ago, he'd made plans to kidnap Lincoln, hoping to trade the president for the Confederate prisoners of the war who could then resume fighting. Under the photo on page 132, John Wilkes Booth, 1838 to 1865. His father, Junius, and his older brother, Edwin, were the leading American actors of their generations. To a lesser degree, John's acting career was also successful. Although often called a madman, his hatred of Lincoln came not from insanity, but from his extreme political beliefs. He supported slavery and disapproved of Lincoln's efforts to stop the Southern Rebellion. Now that Robert E. Lee has surrendered part of the Confederate Army, Booth is even more desperate. In a few hours, he'll impulsively decide to commit an act that he believes will make him a hero, a guardian of liberty, kill Lincoln. Shortly before noon, when he goes to Ford's Theater to pick up his mail, Booth learns Lincoln's plans to attend this evening's performance of a popular comedy, Our American Cousin. Booth immediately realizes this might be his best chance. As a well-known actor, he's familiar to all the theater staff, who won't question if he's wandering around the building. He knows how to get into Lincoln's private box. He's also familiar with the play that's on this evening, so he'll know exactly when to strike and how to escape. It's a bold plan, but that's not all of it. He meets with his accomplices from the kidnapping scheme, and they add other targets. One accomplice will kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the same time Booth is killing Lincoln. Another will kill Secretary of State Seward. Booth hopes to plunge the U.S. government into chaos, giving the Confederacy one more chance to survive. The remains of the day. While the conspirators are plotting, the president is meeting with his cabinet. Lincoln reminds the men that he believes the country's divisions must be healed through compassion, not vengeance. Thus, there must be no persecutions, he says, no hanging or killing these rebel men, even the worst of them. Lincoln and the cabinet also talk about the future of the freed slaves. Where will they go? How will they survive? Should they be allowed to vote? The questions are debated, but no conclusions are reached this day. In the afternoon, while Lincoln and his wife, Mary, take a leisurely carriage ride past the Navy Yard near Capitol Hill, Booth makes his final preparations. He arranges his escape and chooses his weapons, a single-shot Derringer pistol and a sharp Bowie knife. Lincoln and his wife arrive at Ford's Theater around 8:30 p.m. with some guests. Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée. The play, a popular comedy, has already started. The president and his party are shown to their private box, and the crowd welcomes them with a thundering ovation. Under the picture on page 135, the presidential box at Ford's Theater. At the same time Booth is having a drink at a nearby tavern, a customer, recognizing the actor, salutes him with a drunken toast, "You'll never be the actor your father was." "When I leave the stage," Booth replies, "I'll be the most famous man in America." Dramatic exits. Unlike Booth, George Atterzat, whose job is to kill Vice President Johnson, is no actor. His thin face reveals his worry. He's been drinking most of the day to calm his nerves, which is only making things worse. Although he makes his way to Johnson's rooming house, he doesn't immediately try to find his victim. First, he walks into the downstairs bar and orders another drink, and then another. With every sip, he becomes less convinced of the need to assassinate the vice president. Eventually, he simply rides away. Lewis Powell, a former Confederate soldier, has no second thoughts about killing Secretary of State Seward. He talks his way into Seward's house, where Seward is recovering from the accident that occurred the week before, by pretending to deliver some medicine. He fights his way through Seward's son and another man, then slashes the injured Secretary of State's face and neck with a knife, but fails to kill him. Blood is everywhere. Powell escapes into the night. At Ford's Theater, the play is in its second hour, and Booth lurks inside the lobby, listening for just the right moment to attack. He hears the line of dialogue he has been waiting for and begins his route to Lincoln's box. He finds the door unguarded. The substitute bodyguard has left his post for a refreshment. Booth slips inside. No one has noticed him. Booth stands in the shadows behind the president, waiting for one of the actors to say the certain line that he knows will produce a great explosion of laughter. The line is spoken, crowd roars, and Booth fires his pistol, hitting Lincoln in the back of his head. The president goes limp in his chair as Major Rathbone jumps up in surprise. Booth wounds Rathbone with his knife and leaps from the box onto the stage below. The spur on his boot gets caught in a flag and he lands awkwardly, breaking his leg. Before anyone in the theater could react, Booth pulls himself up to his full height and calls out, "Sic semper tyrannis," a Latin phrase meaning "thus always to tyrants," the model state of Virginia. He staggers across the stage and escapes through the back of the theater, where his horse is waiting. He heads for a bridge that will take him out of the city and into Maryland, which is full of friends of the Confederacy. As soldiers rush through the theater to the president's box, a doctor is in the audience, is hoisted directly up from the stage to help Lincoln. He manages to stabilize the stricken leader, but he knows the wound is fatal. It's just a matter of time. Lincoln is carried to a house across the street and stretched out on a bed. He will never regain consciousness. It is 11 o'clock. A death watch begins. When the news spreads, Washington descends into chaos, just as Booth hoped. A manhunt begins. Soldiers fan out in all directions. Telegraph wires hum, sending reports of the attacks to the rest of the nation. Under the photo on page 140, Lincoln on his deathbed. A team of doctors keeps watch over the president. Mary Lincoln repeatedly enters, screams, and faints. The doctors monitor the slow decline of Lincoln's temperature, breathing, and pulse. The bullet that drove through his brain is lodged behind his swollen right eye, which turns purple, then black. At 22 minutes past 7 in the morning, the president lets out his last breath. Secretary of War Edward Stanton, who's been by Lincoln's side throughout the ordeal, whispers a fitting tribute to a man who since childhood hoped to leave an immortal mark on the world. Now he belongs to the ages. After a 12-day manhunt in which he's aided by other conspirators, Booth will be killed. Most of his fellow conspirators will be captured, tried, and hanged.